Hey Dennis, I am Rocky Flats. Everyone out there, this is Dennis McKenna. I am Rocky Flats, and we are sitting here in a beautiful little spot here in Boulder. And I've come to ask you some questions. This is for Colorado Community Radio Network as well. So I'm going to just jump right into it, Dennis.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. My first question, we live in a polarized world where there are two camps. There is the camp that says psychedelics are useful and can benefit society, and there's a camp that says psychedelics are harmful and cannot benefit society. Mm-hmm. I first want to ask you your advice for both camps. What is your advice for the people that find psychedelics to be useful to further them into society? And what is your advice for the people that are against psychedelics that you could also maybe further them into society?
Well, I think, being a scientist and kind of, I'm many things, but I take that approach sometimes. I think evidence is a good thing, often. And I think that the people who claim that psychedelics have no value and are harmful, they need to make that case. And if you really look at how psychedelics are being used and the way the science is stacking up, it doesn't agree with that. We know there's enough data accumulated now that psychedelics can be very beneficial for people with certain kinds of mental problems, and just other things as well. Learning about consciousness, for example, learning about states of mind. But if you just confine it to the therapeutic realm, psychedelics are being shown to be useful for the treatment of intractable depression, PTSD, various kinds of addictions, anxiety for at the end of life and all that. So here is a body of evidence that has come out of very carefully structured clinical studies using psychedelics. And the body of evidence is growing that they have benefits. Well, the people on the other side of it, what have they got to put up against that? And I think really nothing in some sense. Yes, psychedelics can harm some people if they're not used carefully. They need to be used in a very careful, thoughtful way in the proper context, and they're not harmful in that way. When they're used thoughtlessly and essentially without paying attention to setting these really important variables, then they can go off track. They can, but in fact, serious adverse events to psychedelics are extremely rare. There are people who have a proclivity to, schizophrenia and other types of mental diseases that should not take psychedelics, because they may be at risk for not recovering. But serious adverse reactions to psychedelics are rare.
Yeah.
And the people that argue against it, they need to present some evidence to support that argument. I haven't seen them doing that. I think that also, there's a certain knee-jerk judgment often on the part of these people that anything that alters consciousness has got to be bad by definition. So it's not about psychedelics, it's about the idea of altering consciousness.
Where do you think that thought comes from, that fear?
Well, I think it's fear. I think we've been conditioned by many things in our society to, for one thing, devalue inner experience, and for another thing, to fear inner experience. People want deep, spiritual, personally meaningful experiences, and what they get is schlock, from mass media. Most people, I think that a person, you can almost be sure that a person who says that psychedelics has no value and is dangerous is not a person who's ever taken a psychedelic. And I think that's important, and I think that's a real deficit in their reasoning. Take it, then come back and say it has no value. I think you won't be able to. Timothy Leary quipped once that, yes, psychedelics are very dangerous. They drive people who have never taken LSD crazy. Right. And that's true.
Yeah. Well, with that in mind, going into the therapeutic aspect of psychedelics, what are your thoughts on psychedelics and their role in veteran suicides and veteran PTSD?
We know that there's a huge problem with vets and PTSD. Many of the existing therapies are not very effective. Something like MDMA, which seems to be particularly useful for treating trauma and PTSD, is showing very good results. Anywhere from 60 to 80%, depending on a bunch of variables, sample size, and so on. But anywhere from 60 to 80% of the people that have been treated in these PTSD studies, have a much better response than to any other treatment. That doesn't mean it cures them, but it means that over time, it may, and it makes it easier for them to deal with it. I mean, there's no drug, nothing that's going to cure you overnight, But I think what MDMA does, and other psychedelics can be used to treat trauma too, but something that's different about MDMA is it's a heart opener. It works on the emotional level. So it opens your heart, and it gives you a way to kind of review these traumatic events and not be re-traumatized. It lets you look at that from arm's length in a certain way, in a compassionate way, but without having to go through that again. And some other psychedelics are less kind that way. Ayahuasca, for example, you can treat PTSD with ayahuasca, but it's often not as gentle because it will tend to put you right in that place again. You don't have that emotional distance, or you can if you're ready for it. PTSD, MDMA just seems to be a medicine that's good for that kind of thing.
Do you think that ayahuasca could actually cause more trauma if not done right?
If not used in the correct way, it could.
Yeah.
It takes a skilled therapist, and it takes a skilled therapist with all these things. A point that needs to be made is that these are not medicines. If you're using them therapeutically, these aren't medicines where you say, take 2 and call me in the morning. No, right. These have to be used in a context of very intense therapy. The therapy is important as the medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump topics here. First off, can you just basically describe for people what are entheogens?
What are
entheogens?
Entheogens. Well, I don't like the word entheogen myself, because there's an implied value judgment there. Entheogens means generating the God within. That's more of a description of what psychedelics do sometimes than what psychedelics really are. I like psychedelic, even though it carries all that baggage from the 60s, but it's a truer word because it means mind manifesting. Whatever psychedelics do, they manifest the mind, in various aspects, sometimes in really good ways, sometimes in not so good ways. And included under that umbrella is the mystical response, the mystical experience, which you call entheogenic. But what about the psychotomimetic part, part that mimics psychosis? So psychedelic is a big umbrella that says it manifests the mind. In that sense, I think it's a truer term than entheogen.
Gotcha.
Hallucinogen is not current anymore. They used to be called hallucinogens.
Sure.
That was the only word you could use respectably in journals, but now journals accept psychedelics again, which I think is a good sign. It's actually a sign that science is getting a little more honest about this stuff.
Which brings me actually to a personal question. Do you ever experiment or use for microdosing? Do you ever use or microdose yourself in any sense?
I have experimented a little bit with it. I used to be a skeptic before I did it. again, an example of, there's nothing like experience to change your perspective. And if you don't have the experience, you're really not qualified to comment on it. But I was a skeptic about microdosing. I kind of thought, well, it's people that don't really want to take a real psychedelic experience, But at the urging of a friend, I experimented with it for a little bit. Microdoses of LSD First I started out with every 5 micrograms every 4 days. Mm-hmm. And I was amazed. I was surprised that there was a real effect. It was not placebo. It was a definite effect, very subtle, not any real altered state of consciousness, but just a slight more cognitive sparkle. And in the morning, I'm one of these people that has sleep problems. I fall asleep on my 4th cup of coffee. I'm reading the paper. That didn't happen for a while, and then the effects kind of wore up. Then I boosted it. I started taking 10 micrograms every other day, and the effect came back, and then it kind of tapered off. Yeah. So it worked for a while.
Do you think there's a difference in using psilocybin versus LSD in microdosing because of the, you can build up an immunity to LSD versus psilocybin much easier?
You can get tolerant to psilocybin mushrooms as well, but I haven't tried that. I haven't microdosed with mushrooms. I only tried it with LSD. I would suspect it would be the same thing, though, that eventually you'd get insensitive to it, and you want to lay off for 10 days and go back to it. But I was surprised that there was a real effect, at a dose level that shouldn't be anywhere near, an altered state. And it wasn't really an altered state. It was just just slightly more on top of the game kind of idea.
Sure. A little more awareness.
Yeah.
I'm curious on your take of modern medicine. Hallucinogens, similar to marijuana, were subject to ruthless disinformation campaigns for many years. With respect to mental health and recovery, their benefits seem undeniable, yet they have been avoided like the plague. Mm-hmm. Those of us who are aware of this, or are more aware of the issues of modern medicine, how do you approach an illness and Western medicine in general these days to try to incorporate those ideas and those practices?
Well, don't get me started. I think that psychiatric medicine is largely broken. I think that in some rare instances, some of these psychopharmaceuticals can be very beneficial to people, but I think the number of people is much smaller than they're actually prescribed for. I have personally known people who they really need this antidepressant, and they go off track if they don't have it. But I think that's a rare thing, and I think that psychiatric medicine relies way too much on the pharmacotherapy than talk therapy or other types of therapies, and it's partly a matter of the way the medical system is structured. Because a typical patient, psychiatric or otherwise, if they get 10 minutes with a doctor, that's a long time. So therapy requires a therapist to spend time, a lot of time. That's one reason psychedelics, it's difficult to fit them. But a patient goes in to see depression or sleep problems or whatever. They get 10 minutes with the doctor. They expect to walk out with a prescription, and they do. Mm. And it may or may not help. I think that psychedelic medicine is, quite broken. A lot of these psychopharmaceuticals, the evidence is out there that they are rarely better than placebo in many cases. Barely measurable, sometimes not even measurable. And so I think that psychiatric psychopharmacology is largely structured for the convenience of therapists and the pharma industry than it is for the patients. And I think that psychedelics have the potential to, utterly transform, psychiatric medicine, but it's going to be a big push. I mean, and there's a lot of pushback against that. There's an entrenched power structure Big Pharma doesn't want medicines that you take 2 or 3 times in your life.
Yeah.
It's a
They
business.
want medicines you take 4 times a day for the rest of your life,
Right.
and so that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a real problem, and it's going to have to be overturned. And if medicine is going to progress, and I think people are turning to more traditional context to have psychedelic experiences
Yeah.
that we would not think of as a medical treatment, like retreats and this kind of thing. Because people want meaningful spiritual experiences. You're not going to get that in a clinic. Yeah, well, you might. Yeah, with the psychedelic, you might. But you know what I mean. People
Yeah.
are not feeling that. They can go to a doctor with their problems and really find answers
Yeah.
or, real cures. And it's a pity because real cures are possible
Yeah.
with these things.
Well, that brings me to my next question. The Hefter Institute.
Yes.
What kind of research, is there new research going on there? What are you guys doing there right now?
Well, Hefter's like MAPS, but smaller and less noticed than MAPS and less well-funded than MAPS and all of those things.
Sure.
But Hefter is partly because of its origins. I mean, it was founded by scientists, a bunch of scientists, basically, of which I was one of the founders. And, our idea was these things have got to have uses, and we span a range of disciplines within Hefter. And most of the people that have come on the board since are also, active investigators in one way or another. And just not by any plan, but sort of by accident, Hefter's kind of focused on psilocybin, whereas MAPS has tied its wagon to MDMA. We've tied ours to psilocybin.
Okay.
And that's where our focus is. We're working with several university groups on a range of things. Psilocybin is more versatile in some ways. So anxiety at the end of life, there's been several studies with that. There have been studies with addiction, there are studies with PTSD, studies with smoking cessation. It's shown spectacular results for smoking cessation.
Interesting.
Better response than any other treatment for smoking cessation. Small sample, but there needs to be a bigger sample. So it's got, and also psilocybin is, it's being looked at, and Hefter's got sponsored clinical studies to look at it essentially as a tool for understanding consciousness. So these are like giving it to long-term meditators or comparing meditators with people who take psilocybin and looking at what's going on in the brain, how similar, how different is that. So that's kind of interesting because it's being given to people who are not sick, they don't need treatment, but it's a way of kind of understanding consciousness and things like mystical experiences.
Sure.
What goes on during a mystical experience? What goes on in here? And how can you correlate it with what you're actually experiencing?
Right. Speaking of mystical experiences, do you have, personally, what are your, do you find yourself attracted to any sort of spiritual belief structure? Do you find yourself working with certain people of certain spiritual belief structures more so than others? Or how does that play into your life and your roles?
Well, I like ayahuasca. That's probably my primary spirit ally or plant teacher, I would call it. I respect mushrooms. I use mushrooms, but ayahuasca lately has been kind of what I do. And it can be used in lots of contexts. I like the traditional context. Vegetalismo. I like doing it with a curandero. I happen to work with a curandero that I really like. I respect him as a person and also as a shaman. He's very good at his craft, but when he's not on duty, he's also very good at being a human being, and I respect him on that level.
It's always good.
But I don't insist that anybody has to go the way I go, or, there are many contexts that are supportive. and lots of set and settings that are appropriate. I think that there just needs to be a well thought out set and setting. Well, set is something that you bring to the table.
Sure.
Setting is something that you can control to some degree, and then bring that. You create the vessel for it to happen, and then the set is you, whatever you bring to it, all your problems, your disorders, your knowledge, everything else. The set is. So that's not a controlling variable, a controllable variable, but it's a very important as to the outcomes.
Sure. Now, jumping gears a bit here, in your trip to the Amazon with your brother, Terrence.
Yeah.
It's recounted in, I think it's True Hallucinations.
And the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, please.
Right,
don't forget.
Right.
The definitive thing.
Right.
You read True Hallucinations, you must read
Yes.
Brotherhood. It's the real story. It's my story. My half
Okay.
of the story.
Well, that kind of leads me to the question, because we were riveted by the story of the disassociation after your recreation of the internal sound heard on high doses of psilocybin.
Right.
I have heard this brought up a few times. We heard it brought up with Terrence, but we never actually heard it from you in anything we found or researched. So, what do you remember of the time when you were, gone? Do you do any further exploration into the sound, and can you still make that sound?
Well, that's a 4-part question.
It
or
is,
something
sorry.
like that.
Let's just start at the beginning.
I don't regret that any of that happened. I feel it was ultimately a healing thing. One way you could look at it is my prolonged psychotic dissociation. But you could also say, well, it was a shamanic initiation. And it had all the elements of that too, being torn apart and put back together. And that said, I'm not a shaman. I wouldn't be the last person to say I'm a shaman. But that's what happened. And it was integrative. I'm more together now because it happened than I was before. I'm a fairly stable guy.
Sure.
I've been in some pretty wild situations with psychedelics, but I've never lost it that way. And why I lost it that way at that time is complicated. There were many variables. And I remember it. But what I remember, and this is the way memory works, what I remember now is this narrative that I've reconstructed over years so that I can tell that story. That's not the way it was, but it's a chronology, and one of the difficult parts about recounting that story is there wasn't a chronology. There was not first this happened, then that happened, then that happened. That's something I imposed on it later. So what I remember of it is a false memory in a certain sense.
Sure.
All memories are false in a certain sense.
We see that in our life altogether.
Yeah, so we make this up after the fact. I remember it, I mean, like I say, I feel like it was definitely beneficial, although you wouldn't think so at the time.
Sure. Darkest before the dawn sort of deal.
Yeah, darkness before the dawn.
Sure.
And, it's hard to, this is why you got to read my book, because it's actually, there are about 3 chapters that kind of unpack this whole thing. It's a deep subject. Why did this happen? What do you make of it? I don't really want to be remembered. I mean, I guess I'm already in that place, but, you don't want to be remembered, 4-year psychosis that happened, 40 years ago.
Sure.
But, it was a big download. It was a big lesson for me. We got... Oh, what was the question? Can I make the sound?
Yeah.
Probably.
Would you?
No.
Fair enough.
I mean, I don't want to. You might collapse the space-time continuum.
Right?
You know? This
Don't
is like
destroy reality.
the Hadron Collider experiment. Well, there's a very small chance that we're going to collapse the space-time continuum. And and being a scientist, we'd say, well, it's a small chance. Let's go for it. But
Right.
actually, I don't think I could do it. I mean, that's it's too complex and just gnarly a subject to get into in detail.
Yeah. Read the book, right?
Read the book.
That's the answer. All right, let's jump to a lighter note because people got to know about this. A movie version of the story, supposedly created by Peter Bergman, released last year. This is before we get into the Jim Carrey rumor. Were you consulted at all on the making of this compilation?
No.
Okay. What are your impressions on the finished project?
Well, I think it was a good effort. I mean, almost all of it is sound bites and audio video clips from Terrence, so it's right out of his mouth. I think it was a good effort. I wasn't consulted on it, and it's not the way I envisioned would. It's not really the story. It's more a documentary about the story. When I thought about making a movie of True Hallucinations, I was thinking, well, yeah, we'd get somebody like Jim Carrey. It couldn't be Jim Carrey. He's too old. It's got to be the hot new, 24-year-old rising Leonardo DiCaprio or whoever. Leonardo DiCaprio's too old, but
old too.
Somebody like that.
The new Leo.
Yeah, and do a dramatization of that.
Yeah. Which then follows up to the question about Jim Carrey. There were rumors that Jim Carrey was going to play Terrence.
Well, I think that's just a rumor.
Yeah.
I wrote to Peter Bergman about that when I saw that, and I said, is this real? Is this really happening? And he said, no, I think it's just a meme that somebody's trying to introduce into
Damn internet.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's less timely to do it. I kind of like to see True Hallucinations done, but it's it's a little more complicated.
Do you think it's ahead of its time right now?
The movie?
The idea, of the movie. The idea of where you would like to see it. Do you think that people could see that this day, or do you think it's something that would have to come out down the road for people to go, oh, this makes sense now?
I think it could come out now, but it's difficult in some ways on a personal level because it would be it would be hard to make the movie without collaboration with the family. And since I wrote my book, certain people in my family hate me for that. And so, though I've tried to reach out to them, they've chosen not to respond. So if we're going to have a movie, we've got to be able to all contribute.
Sure.
I would not be happy if they wanted to make the movie without consulting me, probably.
Sure.
And, since I'm a major figure in it.
Sure, absolutely.
So that makes it difficult.
Yeah. Going into the internet, let me go to a question there. With the advent of the internet, the amount of information, staggering. And this is true for psychedelics as well. I think it's probably what's helping this awareness happen a lot.
Yes.
My first trip on mushrooms, and I think it's as good a place to start as any, but would you suggest that one cocktail of chemicals is a good first step, or do you think that there should be more of a single-minded, single approach to psychedelic usage, or do you think multiple psychedelic usages?
Rather than take single-minded versus multiple?
Yeah.
Well, I think both have merit. I think that it depends on what your goal is. So you've got the psychonaut approach, which is I will take any substance I can get my hand on and create a cartography of my inner state, put data points on a map, essentially.
Right.
That's valid. Not everybody's capable of that. Not everybody's really qualified to do that. I mean, I think Alexander Shulgin is the best example. He took many, many hundreds of compounds, tested them on himself, but he kept careful notes and he approached it very, in a very scientific way. maybe some psychonauts do that, and that's great. As far as me personally, I do not feel compelled to try every possible psychedelic. I mean, I wouldn't get anything else done. So many drugs, so little time. Not necessary. I tend to. I just ally myself with a couple of ones that are important, and that's mainly to me personally. That I feel are my teachers, plant teachers, and that's mushrooms and ayahuasca.
Yeah.
And I just prefer to work with those. They both have a lot to teach me, so I can't. I mean, maybe if I was younger, I'd be more interested in being a psychonaut, but I'm sort of not at this point.
Have that energy to go along with it.
Yeah. It's a young man's game.
Speaking of psychedelic usage and stuff, we were talking earlier before the interview, and it's a good question to have. There are people with families, there are kids out there, there are psychonauts out there with whole families. What are some good resources or advice for families that want to experiment with psychedelics but not endanger their family or their freedoms? Is there any good resources out there, good advice that you might be able to give them?
Well, the one I would mention is this psychedelicparenting.org, which is a nonprofit founded by Jonathan Thompson. Exactly, and I know him pretty well, and faced with exactly this, he's a responsible parent. But he and his wife, they do psychedelics. They value psychedelics in their life. And so they created this because a lot of parents with young children are in the same boat. And we got to move beyond the just say no thing, that just say N-O, to the just say no, K-N-O-W.
Yeah.
And drugs are a fact of life, and kids are going to run into all sorts of drugs. Most of the most dangerous ones are already legal. And those are the ones, tobacco and alcohol, those are the most dangerous drugs by far. And we teach our kids to hopefully not use them, or use them responsibly, whatever that means, not use them to excess. And we expect that, and we say we have a realistic expectation that they can learn to use these drugs. Why should psychedelics be any different? They can be taught to be used in a responsible way. Or, kids can always be said, if you choose not to use psychedelics, that's great. We won't think any less of you because you don't choose to take psychedelics. If you do, here's some common sense, guidelines for it. The problem, again, I think a big problem with the drug problem in general, whatever it is lack of education, lack of effective drug education. The only model we had for that before was DARE, which has been shown to be completely ineffective, pretty much ineffective, because they don't give you real information, they give you propaganda.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. A few years ago, I taught a course called Culture, Drugs, and Society. It was an experimental course. And the usual demographic that I teach is young, 20-somethings, right? So we had this course. We all went around, why are you in this course? What do you want to get out of this course? They almost all said, well, I first got interested in drugs when I took DARE. And I've been curious ever since. And into it,
Yeah.
Interestingly, the person who was the head of the Minnesota DARE program, the whole state program, was a student in this course. And she was appalled. And I said, I'm sorry, Kathy, this is the reality. Your courses are taught by people who don't know anything about drugs. And law enforcement officers, why should they be teaching a course about drugs?
Yeah.
We don't ask pharmacologists to teach courses about law enforcement. So why don't you get some qualified people teaching it who will give real information?
Yeah.
And the nub of it is, that drug education courses need to teach people how to use drugs.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always a valid choice not to do it, but if you choose to do it, then you should have information on how to do it.
Right.
Like any other dangerous thing that we do, driving a car, having sex, all of these things. You know, and sex education is another good example where the solution, you know, the real answers are too real to be articulated, so it's abstinence, and so on, which is utterly absurd. You're talking to 20-year-olds who are full of hormones. I mean, you know, right. They're going to experiment with sex, right? And this is not a bad thing. But there are certain ways to do that safely and other ways not. So, like so much of our education system, we have to get over it. We have to, you know, we have to stop dishing out propaganda and start dishing out real information. Yeah. You know, and that's the answer. If you know, and organizations like psychedelicparenting.org, and they're trying to fill the gap that the federal or school programs don't fill because they can't get past it.
Yeah. You know, that brings me to my final question here. You know, how much hope do you have for the world? What chance do you give the human race for pulling out of it at the last minute? Or as like in Joe Rogan framed it, if you're cramming for a test, what are the chances are we going to pass? You know, is this viewpoint something that has changed in recent memory? To reframe the question, has your outlook on our chances of success improved or degraded in the last couple of years?
You know, whether we're going to pull it out of the fire at the last minute the way it's happening, you know, I don't know.
That's a good answer.
The short answer is I don't know. I give it 50-50.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that, I mean, I'm heartened by the growth of the psychedelic movement. I'm heartened by the growth in mass awareness of things like ayahuasca and mushrooms and these, you know, these other plant teachers and these intentional communities like this one that are forming, like Daniel or someone last night said in Boulder, everybody's growing mushrooms. Good for them. That's a great thing for them to be doing because mushrooms are teachers, you know, important teachers. And I think it's just a question of if we listen to these plant medicines, then we know what the solutions are. The tricky part is we in the psychedelic world tend to get in a, you know, we don't realize how small the bubble is that we're in, you know, and there are far more people who don't know anything about it, don't want to know anything about it, don't give a shit, and think that the whole thing is a bad thing, you know, and whether that group will prevail or not is hard to say.
Sure.
You know, we hope that it will be. I mean, people are open to reasonable information. You'd like to think so. I'm not so sure anymore. I mean, it just baffles me that we're kind of evolving into this post-fact, post-science world where, you know, I mean, people are literally saying, don't bother me with your inconvenient facts. I know what I believe, and that's what it's going to be.
Yeah.
That's a sad statement.
Do you think the political realm we live in today might be a danger to this psychedelic community?
Well, I don't think they can stop it.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it is a danger. There's always, you know, the political powers always try to suppress unconventional ideas. That's why psychedelics are dangerous. Not that they're dangerous drugs. They make you have dangerous ideas. And this is why when LSD dropped into society in the 60s, it was immediately recognized that this is socially destabilizing. Yeah. And that's why the effort to suppress it was so brutal and ultimately so ineffective, right? Yeah. But it was brutal because it was seen as a threat to the accepted wisdom and the power of the entrenched forces. But everything. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I think we're in the same period right now. you know, and it won't be any more effective. Dangerous ideas cannot be suppressed, you know, and but many people can suffer, and there can be a lot of, you know, bad things that happen in the effort to suppress dangerous ideas, but ultimately that's what changes the world. And you know, I mean, even though it's a small bubble, it's a very active bubble, and it's spreading. It's not even a bubble. Bubble is the wrong metaphor. Sure. It's now like a mycelial network, and it's engulfing the earth, and there are nodes, there are like ganglia of activity, but those effects are being, you know, felt far and wide.
Yeah.
And because of the internet and all that, the propagation of information is so fast. So I'm hopeful that people will get the message in time. That's the key thing, is enough people going to wake up in time to, you know, you've got to have this global shift in consciousness before you can begin to get on the same page of, sure, okay, we are in a heap of shit. Now what do we do about that?
Sure.
You know, and that's where the plant teachers are trying to get us to that point. Like, you know, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I'm an optimist. The rest of the time, I'm a pessimist. You know, or whatever.
One day, I don't care. Yeah.
I mean, I am hopeful.
Sounds like a God and the devil kind of thing.
Right,
yeah. I'm hopeful, but I'm also realistic. But, you know, I don't think we can just give in to despair, because then we know it's not going to work. We have to just keep plugging. We have to just keep talking to people, doing events like this, putting this out there. And obviously we're making progress, you know. And when you got the Today Show giving a show about the benefits of psychedelics,
that was last week too.
That couldn't happen.
Yeah,
you know,
like even a year ago.
Even a year ago. Yeah. So there is progress.
That's true.
You know, there is progress.
All right. Well, that was all the questions I had for you, Dennis.
Okay, good.
I appreciate that.
That wasn't bad.
No, that was feasible. So we'll be seeing your performance tomorrow.
Yes.
And I appreciate that. Well, thank you very much for your time, Dennis. I greatly appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And thank you very much.
Thanks. Always a pleasure.